9 years ago, Warner Bros. Watched a Superman movie make a mountain of money, felt good about it, greenlit an even bigger sequel, and then watched that sequel collapse in its second weekend. That was Man of Steel into Batman v Superman. Different studio era, different director, same company, same character family. Fast forward to this summer, and the exact same pattern just happened again, except this time it took half the time to unfold. Superman worked. The follow-up did not. And the follow-up wasn't some random side character either, it was practically family. This is the story of how James Gunn's brand new DC universe, built specifically to avoid the old DCU's mistakes, ended up repeating one of its biggest ones inside of a single year. If you're new here, I spend an unhealthy amount of time tracking how these giant franchise universes get built, and more importantly, how they get broken. Not because I enjoy watching things fail, I promise, but because the failures teach you more about how Hollywood actually works than the successes do. Anyone can point at a hit and say, great writing, great marketing, good job, everyone. It takes a little more digging to figure out why a $180 million movie with a beloved character and a fresh start behind it opened to less than what some horror movies make in a weekend. So let's dig in. Quick context for anyone who checked out of DC movies a while back, which fair. In December 2024, Warner Bros. Tried something new. Instead of another quiet reboot, they brought in James Gunn, the guy who made the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy work at Marvel, and producer Peter Safran, and gave them control over basically everything DC. Movies, television, animation, games, all one continuity, all one creative vision. They called it the DC Universe, and anything that didn't fit got shuffled off into a separate label called DC Elseworlds, so it wouldn't muddy the timeline. The plan launched with a TV show, Creature Commandos, and then in 2025, the big one, Superman, directed by Gunn himself, starring David Corenswet. And it worked. Critics liked it. Audiences liked it. It made real money. For the first time in a while, DC had a movie people weren't rolling their eyes at. So naturally, the pressure shifted to whatever came next. And what came next was Supergirl. Here's the thing. Supergirl wasn't some random spin-off pulled out of a hat. Millie Alcock's Kara Zor-El was introduced at the end of Superman, so there was already a built-in reason for audiences to care. The film, directed by Craig Gillespie, is based on Tom King and Bilquis Evely's Comic Woman of Tomorrow, which fans generally consider one of the better modern Supergirl stories. On paper, this is a smart pick. Kara didn't grow up on Earth like her cousin. She grew up on Krypton, watched everyone she knew die, and has a completely different relationship with grief and identity because of it. The film leans into that. She copes by partying across different planets, until she crosses paths with a young alien named Ruthie after the same threat that poisons her dog Crypto, also kills Ruthie's father. From there, it becomes a revenge story. Something closer to True Grit in space than a typical origin movie. That's a genuinely interesting pitch. A damaged, chaotic anti-hero version of Supergirl, adjacent to the freshly successful Superman, based on well-regarded source material. This should have worked. It did not work. Let's just sit with the numbers for a second, because they tell the story better than any opinion can. Supergirl was budgeted somewhere between $170 and $186 million. Add in around $120 million in global marketing, and industry estimates put the studio's total exposure north of $300 million, which means the film needed to clear roughly $315 million worldwide just to break even. It opened domestically at just over $37 million. Worldwide opening weekend landed around $68 million, and then in its second weekend, it dropped somewhere between 70 and 74%, depending on which tracking source you check. For comparison, a healthy second weekend drop for a big blockbuster is usually somewhere in the 40 to 50% range. 70+% is the kind of number that shows up when word of mouth actively turns people away rather than just fading out. Deadline's own estimate put the studio's total loss on this film somewhere around $125 million. Critically, it landed in the mid-50s on Rotten Tomatoes, with the audience score sitting noticeably higher, which is its own separate conversation we'll get to in a second. Okay, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because this isn't a new story for this specific franchise. Rewind to 2013. Zack Snyder relaunches Superman with Man of Steel. It's not a critical darling, but it makes $670 million worldwide against a $225 million budget, a clear financial win. Warner Bros. Feels confident. They follow it up with Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice in 2016, a much bigger, much more ambitious film that was supposed to build an entire connected universe practically overnight. Dawn of Justice made money on its opening weekend, but then suffered one of the most infamous second weekend collapses in modern blockbuster history. Warner Bros. Panicked. They started making frantic changes to the DC slate, chasing whatever they thought would fix the brand, and that panic is widely considered one of the core reasons the entire DCEU experiment eventually fell apart, leading directly to the reset we're talking about today. So look at the shape of that pattern. Strong, financially solid first film, mixed critical reaction, followed by a second film built on bigger ambition and higher expectations that collapses hard in its second week. That is almost exactly what just happened with Superman and Supergirl, just compressed into a single year instead of 3. The DC universe was supposedly built by people who watched the DCU implode up close. James Gunn and Peter Safran took over specifically to avoid these mistakes. And yet the sophomore slump showed up, right on schedule anyway. Numbers and history are one thing, but let's actually talk about why. Because unlike some flops, this one doesn't have a single clean villain. It's a stack of smaller problems. First, sequencing. Superman is arguably the most recognizable superhero on the planet. Following him up with his cousin, wearing a similar suit, with similar powers, was always a risky move for only the second movie in a brand new universe. Industry analysts have pointed out that positioning a B-list adjacent character this early, before the universe had time to establish itself, put an enormous amount of weight on Kara's shoulders before audiences had any reason to be invested in her specifically. Second, tone. Test audiences reportedly scored the film as, quote, good, not great, during internal testing back in March. And in a summer this competitive, good, but not great just doesn't move tickets anymore. Social listening firms picked up a recurring complaint before the film even opened that it felt overly stylized in a very specific, very familiar way, closer to Guardians of the Galaxy than to a grounded Supergirl story. When your new character starts feeling like a genre exercise instead of her own person, that's a problem. Third, the marketing and press cycle didn't do it any favors either, with some off-message moments from the promotional run that added friction rather than excitement heading into release. And fourth, and maybe most importantly, the superhero genre itself is just in a different place than it was a decade ago. One studio executive was quoted saying, bluntly, that Gen Z largely doesn't care about superhero movies the way millennials did. Whether or not you fully agree with that, the box office data across multiple studios this year backs up the general trend. The audience that shows up automatically for a cape, just because it's a cape, is shrinking. Oh, how is DC actually responding to this? Publicly, co-CEO Peter Safran called it disappointing, but framed it as one piece of a much longer 10-year strategy, insisting the studio remains confident in the broader plan. That's the standard studio playbook after a miss. Stay calm. Point to the roadmap. Don't overreact in public. But there's real tension underneath that statement. With Warner Bros. Discovery's massive merger with Paramount looming, insiders have openly questioned whether Gunn and Safran even survive the corporate shakeup that's coming, regardless of what the official messaging says. One talent agent went as far as telling reporters that while DC as a brand will obviously continue no matter what, they personally don't think Gunn makes it through. That's speculation, not confirmed fact, but tells you how nervous the wider industry is watching this play out in real time. Where does DC go from here? The next film up is Clayface, arriving this fall, and it's a deliberate contrast to Supergirl in almost every way. Much smaller budget, reportedly around $40 million, horror-tinged tone, and it wasn't even originally part of Gunn's plan slate. It came in from a spec script by Dr. Sleep filmmaker Mike Flanagan. In a strange way, Clayface might end up being the more important release of the two, purely because expectations are so much lower and the financial risk is so much smaller. Beyond that, Gunn himself is currently directing Man of Tomorrow, the next chapter in the main Superman line, slated for mid-2027. And that's really the project worth watching, because it will tell us whether this Supergirl stumble was an isolated miscalculation or the first crack in the foundation of a universe that was supposed to be smarter than the one before it. Here's what I keep coming back to. The DCU's biggest mistake was never really Batman v Superman underperforming. Movies underperform all the time. That's just part of the business. The actual mistake was what happened after: the panic, the sudden pivot, the visible scrambling that told audiences the people in charge didn't have a plan and were making it up as they went. Gunn and Safran have, so far, avoided that same trap, at least publicly. They're not tearing up the roadmap after one underperforming film. Whether that's genuine confidence or just controlled messaging while the real decisions happen behind closed doors, we honestly won't know for a while. But history has already shown this franchise exactly what panic looks like and exactly where it leads. Supergirl is a real financial setback. There's no spinning that away. What happens over the next year, starting with Clayface this fall, is going to say a lot more about this universe's future than one difficult summer weekend ever could. That's where things stand right now. A universe built specifically to learn from the last one's mistakes, tripping over almost the exact same one, just faster. If you want to see how this actually plays out, Clayface hits theaters this October, and I'll be covering it the moment numbers come in. Let me know down in the comments whether you think DC sticks the landing with Man of Tomorrow, or whether we're watching the start of a familiar pattern all over again. Subscribe if you want to be here for that conversation, and I will see you in the next one.